Welcome everyone. Today we're going to continue with part 2 of the Ogre of Aptos. Now Ed Kemper was the middle child of 3 children, and he was the only boy in the Kemper family. And as I said before, Ed Kemper Jr., his father, was actually in World War II and was actually in the Secret Service. And when he was discharged from the service, he had actually picked up a job as an electrician, and he did fairly well. But Clarnell, Ed Kemper III's mother, would often emasculate him and say that it was a menial job. Ed Kemper Jr. would also go in and say that being in the Secret Service and dealing with atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with Clarnell. And her treatment towards Ed Kemper Jr. was no different in how she had treated her son, Ed Kemper III. She would constantly emasculate him and physically abuse him, and whatever chance she would have, she would always sit there and call him stupid, a weirdo. And on one occasion, Ed Kemper Jr. said that he had returned home, and we had asked where his son was. Clarnell would sit there and say, I told him to go out town and sell every newspaper we had, and told him not to return home till he had sold every last one. Junior would sit there and go looking for his son and find him in a street corner, sitting in a corner crying because he had not sold every last newspaper. And he would sit there and tell his son, let's go home. Eventually, Ed Kemper Jr. and Clarnell would actually get a divorce. And at that point, Clarnell would actually move to Montana, away from California, from where his father lived. And the abuse just got much worse. She would sit there and make Ed live in a cellar. Ed would actually go on and tell people that he really felt like he was just secret, because she would just keep him in this cellar where his sisters and her would sleep upstairs comfortably in the warm beds. And he would almost describe it as they were supposed to be in heaven, and he was just supposed to go down to hell where all the demons and the other monsters lived. And it wasn't just his mother that would sit there and abuse him. There was a lot of stories that his sisters would sit there and treat him very badly as well. On one occasion, when Ed was only 8, his older sister actually pushed him in front of a train that was coming by, and he narrowly escaped. And when Ed was 8 years old, he was actually pushed into the deep end of the pool, knowing he couldn't swim, by his older sister. It is also said that when Ed was only 10 years old, his sister, who was 14 at the time, had actually told him to come into the room with her, and at that point had molested him. Now, there's not much to go on because it hasn't been confirmed by Ed himself. These are just hearsays by just different accounts. But it does explain how Ed had such a very warped kind of persona. His younger sister would sit there and say that Ed had a lot of weird practices. One occasion, she had talked about he had a game that he would like to play with his sisters, where he would sit there and make them tie him up in a chair. And he called the game Electric Chair. And after they would tie him up, they would sit and hit an invisible switch, and he would sit there and writhe around in pain, acting like he was being electrocuted in the electric chair. But when Ed was around 15, he had had enough of the abuse from Charnel, and he had actually ran away home and went to live with his father for about 2 weeks. But sadly, within those 2 weeks, Ed Kemper Jr. had decided he had to go live with his maternal grandparents, because there were just things going on that made him and his family that he had remarried into really uncomfortable. They would say that he would just sit around and stare at his stepmother while she was getting dressed. And eventually Ed Kemper Jr. would sit there and tell him, you need to move in within your maternal grandparents. It wasn't shortly after he had moved back that within a couple weeks after that he had actually murdered his grandparents, which he was actually released 5 years later when he was 21. But as I said before, under the guise that he would not live with his mother, Carnell, because that's where all of his anger and frustrations and problems stem from. But because he could not find a right place to live at, he had no choice but to live with his mother, regardless of what the doctors had emphasized.